are going live.
Okay.
Hello, everyone. I'm joined today with Emmy Award winning journalist Lynn Walsh. She was also the former president of the Society of Professional Journalists and participated in both the SPJ Airplay panel, organized by Michael Koretsky and the Society of Professional Journalists to discuss Gamergate, as well as the panel at South by Southwest, commonly referred to as the Save Point panel. How are you doing today, Lynn?
Good. I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for agreeing to do this. So have you seen any of the interviews so far?
I have not. No.
Okay. All right. Well, I interviewed Koretsky a couple months ago and some of the other people who were there at the panel, including Game Diviner, Ash Scow, uh, others as well. But basically, I am doing this book about Gamergate, my second book. This one's a book of interviews. And I thought Lynn Walsh, former president of the Society of Professional Journalists, they're at Airplay, they're at Save Point, one of the few journalists who seem to actually care about getting the truth out about Gamergate. I've got to interview her.
Well, I'm glad to be here and glad to talk just about whatever you want to know, why I did it, or kind of what I remember about the experience, or anything like that.
Yeah, sure. Normally I have like a battery of like 75 questions, but we've got such a short time span that we might just do like a few. I'm basically winging it right now. But sure, yeah. How did you find out about this Gamergate thing?
Yeah, so I was approached, I believe it was by Koretsky actually. He and I'm not sure exactly, I'm sure he um shed some light, and I don't really quite remember how he came to be involved with it. But basically, if I'm remembering properly, how it was kind of presented to me is, some people who have questions about journalism ethics. And really, I think at the time it was kind of assumptions about how journalists do their job. Would you be willing to talk about it? And the other part of it was hear what some of the experiences were of people who were being reported on and people doing reporting on the gaming industry. And so I said, sure, why not? I think it's really important for journalists, and especially if you're a journalist associated with an organization that prides itself on ethics, prides itself on helping the public and helping journalists produce better, more ethical content, and we should be having these conversations. And it's really one of the only ways, I think, to build back trust in information, is to be able to ask questions, get answers, and have discussions about how things are done.
And that was the first half of the Airplay panel for sure. People brought up concerns that they have in the gaming industry, with games journalism in particular. What did you think of the concerns that they raised?
I'm going to be honest. I think I don't remember quite all of them. I will say, though, something that was eye opening to me was how little people who are not in journalism and not working in journalism, or know someone who's a journalist, how little people do know about the process. And the one thing I will say about that is that's not people's fault, right? Like, we as journalists have a responsibility in that, and I think for a long time have taken it for granted that we as journalists just kind of, we did what we did. We didn't explain things. We maybe didn't answer questions from the public. And I think that's been a disservice to the industry. And so I remember specifically one question or assumption that someone made was that a journalist will get a DM from someone. This was back, several years ago. So on Twitter, and they will just use the information without fact checking it, without knowing who the person is, that an anonymous source um, is someone that they don't know at all. And in a lot of cases, that's actually not the case when an anonymous source is used. Most of the time, a journalist does know who that is, and also their editor knows who that is. And so it was just kind of a big up call to me about how we need to talk about these things and explain these things, because if we don't, how would anyone assume the best of our intentions, if that makes sense?
Yeah, and a lot of the people I interview, they have a lot of a lot of negative opinions about journalism. Do you? Well, I guess what first of all, like, what is a journalist? I guess we should ask.
Well, that's a great question. I think, with technology and with the fact that, the internet, with social media, with the fact that we all have the ability of having the phone in our hand to commit an act of journalism. It's so easy now that I think the definition of a journalist is really, I think, one that's hard to define because all of us can commit an act of journalism. Really, you could argue you're committing an act of journalism every time you might be posting something you saw in your neighborhood on Nextdoor or sharing something about your life on Facebook or something about what you experienced today, right? I mean, that's a form of sharing information, and we all are doing it. And so I think, when you look at kind of the traditional sense, though, of I guess what a journalist is, I think it's someone who is doing that type of sharing of information, reporting on information on a daily basis. And I would say if you are an ethical journalist, which hopefully, and most that I have worked with are, you are following different codes that exist where you are trying to minimize harm, you are trying to report the facts, you are fact checking, and you are trying to get as many sides as possible before coming to a conclusion. I think, as much, I don't think necessarily to be considered a journalist, you have to go to journalism school. There are plenty of people committing acts of journalism and that are informing people accurately and fairly and responsibly that don't have that degree. And I think that are serving a they're providing a service that people need and people want. So it's definitely changing and I think becoming more difficult to put a definition to that.
Yeah, I view this project as being an act of journalism, and I don't know if I started thinking it that
Absolutely.
way, but Koretsky and I talked, and I'm like, you know what, I think this is, and I just sort of like gradually adopted that worldview more and more as I've worked on the project. There is
I mean,
this.
absolutely. You are sorry
No,
to
go ahead.
interrupt, but you are absolutely by conducting interviews, by asking people, and I'm not sure what capacity this will look like, but if you are going back and you're fact checking things and you're going to kind of put together sort of a timeline, and I know it might not be a timeline, but you're going to retell what events that happened and quotes from people and ask them questions. And that is journalism. That is what we do. And that's why I think it's really important for journalists, especially, but for all of us to really think about, before we publish something, before we share something, what's the implication? Are we sure it's true? And I know people don't think about that because they're like, oh, it's just my account on X or I'm just here on Discord. No one's gonna take what I say and think it's true, but people do. And so we all have that responsibility to take that very seriously.
Yeah, I've tried to be very careful in how I approach the interviews and facts and like just not just for this project but in general. And it's kind of annoying. It's kind of funny too because like other streamers, a lot of them, not everybody, but like a lot of them don't like care about the facts so much, and they just like it's like I'll be on stream with them, and they'll be like. Uh, They'll be like, oh, they'll say something, or they'll hear somebody say something in an interview or something, and I'm in the conversation too, or I'm in the chat. I'm like, hey, that claim's not true. And I expect them to like fact check it, but they never do half the. Well, heck, half the time they do, half the time they don't. So it just depends. Like some people are better than others. Anyway, we got such a short time span here. There's a perception, a widespread perception that the GamerGate people have, and people who are familiar with the topic in great detail have, that the media didn't do a very good job of covering this, and maybe even like was unethical.
Yeah, I mean, and this is something that, I'd want to go back and like if you had specific examples, I'd be glad to kind of weigh in more specifically. But I think I remember having conversations with people about this. And I think one potential problem with the coverage, I think, is that there, one, I think the gaming industry was just undercovered by a lot of sort of more mainstream publications. I think probably still is. And I'd love to hear your opinion on that. And when that happens, you are kind of throwing reporters into something they don't know, right? And they're in a place where they were forced to probably gather information quickly, put a story together quickly, and maybe the due diligence that should have gone into it, which was a complicated issue depending on what some of the issues were, right? A lot of kind of maybe he said, she said, a lot of kind of digging into fact checking that didn't get done the way it probably should have, and got done too quickly to publication. And I think that resulted in probably a lot of people, not a lot of people, but like you said, people thinking that it was that the coverage was not fair and potentially unethical.
Yeah, there's so many different examples. I guess the main one was just it's just something that they all repeated basically, for the most part. Um, it's that GamerGate's a harassment campaign, and they didn't interview anybody who supported GamerGate by and large. They didn't talk to a single person who supported the movement that they were talking about. Um, well, a couple exceptions did, like Kathy Young and David Auerbach, Eric Kane, but like that's very much the exception. Michael Koretsky, of course, as well, but that's the exception. Like nobody covered this. Like the New York Times didn't talk to anybody. ABC News didn't talk to anybody. None of the other publications, The Economist, the BBC did, but they only used like 30 seconds or something from the interview that they did with somebody about it. So, but like
Yeah.
yeah,
And so that's where, yeah,
it's just like they didn't talk to a
go
single
ahead.
person.
Well, and then you wonder too, and you would probably know this more than I would because you're connected to people personally, but you also wonder, did they talk to people and not use them in the stories? Like that's another possibility. And I think, a lot of times with reporting, I know as a journalist, I've talked to so many people that then don't end up in the story. For a variety of different reasons. And I think there's a responsibility on the journalist. One, we should be explaining that if that happened. Two, we should be making sure that the people we're talking to understand that just because we're having this conversation, you may or may not end up in the piece, and explaining if they didn't, why, right? Um, but, I think the important thing, though, that you're pointing out is I don't think Gamergate is alone in that. I mean, there are articles that I read, both in local news, national news, where you see stories that really only have one perspective included. And to me, that's not providing full context on an issue, and that's not producing, ethical journalism. It's not to say that maybe that piece is unethical, but if your goal is to explain what's happening with a situation, you absolutely need to talk to both sides. And oftentimes it's not both sides, there's multiple sides, right? To kind of fully get a picture. And if you're deciding then not to include a certain perspective, you should be saying why. Is it because you think that what they're saying isn't true? Is it because you feel that it's not important to include in the story? And then now you're making a decision, right, about the content and what you're sharing. And so all of that should be, as journalists, we should be doing those things. We should be talking to all those involved. And we really should be including the other side or multiple sides again in coverage. Now, if what the person is saying isn't true, there are ways that you can say, include them and then say, well, we found out that that wasn't true. But still, allowing people to see that other side is important.
Yeah, and that just didn't happen, and they didn't. It's not like you did ask if they interviewed people and didn't include it. For the vast majority of
Mhm.
cases, that doesn't seem to be the case. I've interviewed over 30 people involved with the GamerGate controversy, including most of like the key figures, I guess you could say, and most of them never got contacted by a single media outlet whatsoever. A couple did, like, well, only one did, I guess, or I could go back through all the records, but the only person who did, I think, was Alex Baldwin, the Hat Man from the Kotaku and Action forums, because he was the head moderator. But basically, nobody else seemed like got contacted by a single journalist, even though they were making YouTube videos about this. They were some of the people organizing events, like Michael Koretsky. Um, it seemed like nobody,
Mhm.
or maybe he got talked to, I don't know, but it seemed like nobody talked to anybody about this at all. And when they did, they'd talk to one of the people who said that Gamergate was trying to harass them, rather than the people who were involved with Gamergate. Which, like, they can include that perspective too. I'm not saying they shouldn't, but Yeah, it just seems really bad. Anyway,
Right.
with the time constraints, I, uh, what can you define what you thought GamerGate was? Because you actually, well, you interacted with this at the Airplay event, and then you decided to re-engage with the topic again and do the South by Southwest panel. I guess before I ask you what GamerGate was, could you explain why you wanted to do a second event?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, again, I think especially in the position that I was in at that time, which was serving, it was when I was either on the board or serving as president of the Society of Professional Journalists. I mean, I felt a responsibility to, yes, represent journalism and talk to journalists and help journalism and journalists be better, but really felt a really strong responsibility to the public. And I think, I wish we would do more of that just as the field in general. But so that was, when Kretzky asked me the first time, I was like, of course. And, there were people that were saying, oh, should SPJ get involved with this? And oh, it's going to look bad for SPJ. And I guess if there is someone that has a question about journalism and they want to have a real conversation about how it works, I wanted to be able to give that space to them. And while the conversation, we had the bomb threat at Airplay, um, things didn't always go maybe as planned or kind of as like a perfect event. There were still people there that definitely wanted to engage and had genuine questions. And so that's why I decided to engage and to answer those questions and continue to sometimes have people answer questions. Now, I will say I'm not a gamer, and I think I've said this many, many times. I am not, especially now, years later. I feel like I'm even further away from what's happening in gaming, from the gaming world, from GamerGate. Uh, so I'm not the best to kind of weigh in and understand that culture, and I've kind of always said that. But I am always happy to answer questions about if they have questions about how they were covered, they want to talk about a specific story, they have questions about how journalism works. I'm glad to answer that.
Okay, and you obviously interacted with a lot of the GamerGate people, probably more than almost all the other journalists who covered this, both in real life and online. So I want to ask, can you define what GamerGate was?
Oh, geez. I know. As you set that up, I'm like, could I define what Gamergate was? Um, I guess so. And this is probably going to be terrible because for me, I looked at it as there were accusations of harassment that was then covered by mainstream media. And that then kind of made that and the whole topic even more, I guess, popular or brought it more into the mainstream. And I felt like that's the whole focus of what anyone was focusing on is this harassment inside the gaming community. Um, Gamergate was helping people who are not familiar with journalism and who are gamers learn a little bit more about journalism. And it was also getting a glimpse into how they were interacting with some mainstream journalists and their frustrations, which I think is, you know, that should be shared with journalists. And I also hope, and I forget at the time, I know I asked people, I hope that those frustrations were shared with some of the journalists if they talked to them and didn't feel like their side was represented or that the coverage was fair.
Now, after the Airplay event, the SPJ decided to weigh into games journalism some more, not just through your SafePoint panel, though that was part of it, but also through the Kunkel Awards, where
Yes.
they awarded prizes, not prizes, but they awarded awards to people who've committed, who sorry, I should let me word this in a way that's like not stupid. They awarded awards for excellence in feature and video streaming relating to video game journalism, news slash video streaming, esports writing, college gaming journalism, feature writing in games journalism, news reporting in games journalism, and that these awards were supposed to, I guess, instill the games journalism industry with a sense of commitment to ethics and something to strive for. You could, because it's a prestigious award that well, I, I'm so bad at talking about this because I'm so pressured because of the time constraints. I'm so sorry. Um,
No, it's okay.
Normally, like these interviews go super smooth because like it's whatever. Um, I mean, I take it very seriously, but I've got um, and I'll just ask
Now
you.
you understand the pressure. Now you understand the pressure of putting together a newscast, right? Where you have 30 seconds.
Well, I still don't think they should lie about people though, and they do.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, no, 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 no. I'm not saying that, but there is the time constraint is a pressure and makes the job harder
Yeah.
for sure.
Anyway, so they made the Kunkel Awards to promote good games journalism and to create a positive incentive for games journalists who do a good job. Um, and this went from I think 2015 to 20. It went from around the time of Airplay to a few years ago, and now it's come to a close. Uh, what made the SPJ and you interested in doing this project?
Yes, that was another idea. I believe I'm pretty sure it was Kretsky's idea. And the thought is, well, one, I truly believe that anyone can commit an act of journalism, and that there are multiple people that are committing acts of journalism that are not seen as journalists, maybe don't even see themselves as journalists, whether this is people on YouTube, this is people here on Discord, this is people writing books, whatever that might be. So we saw this as a way to engage with people in that specific area of gaming to see if we could help instill ethics as they are doing this anyways, right? And I really believe that that is something that SPJ should do more of, not just in gaming, but in other areas. There are people out there sharing information every day that people trust, that people go to and turn to for information. And if that's not journalists in the traditional sense at a TV station or a newspaper, then that's fine. But how can we make sure that that information is ethical, responsible, and accurate? And so, yeah, that was kind of the thought that by doing this, does this encourage people to want to kind of adopt maybe not SPJ's code of ethics, but similar codes of ethics, um, and get to that standard.
Yeah, a lot of the people I've interviewed have a very negative opinion of journalism as it exists today, and a lot of people in society too trust in the media is very low.
Oh,
And this seems to be like a
yes,
major
it
issue
is.
in our society for like a whole host of reasons. Like, I, I don't, I'm not an expert on media ethics, but it seems like there's like so many different factors that go into this. Like, first of all, the media has made like a large number of mistakes, especially in recent years, including the GamerGate mistake that they made, among many others. And they don't seem to be willing to like reform or learn from those mistakes. And so that's just causing people to become dissatisfied.
Yeah. So, I mean, trust in news and media, especially if you ask it that way, like, do you trust media? Most people are going to say no. Um, and it is unfortunate because I know in my experience, and my experience working as a journalist has primarily been working in local US based TV news organizations. I can tell you that the people I worked with were ethical, strived every day to be ethical, worked so hard to be accurate and get it right. Um, Unfortunately, though, you can point to instances in local and especially in national news where you're like, what? That's terrible. And they are harming people, they are harming institutions, they are harming different groups of people in the process. That is not a good thing. And so there's a lot of improvement that needs to be done. One, there's a lot of damage that has been done. And there's also, though, I think a lot that can be done to improve the relationship. And I think really, if we want to live in a society where we have a shared set of facts, can have conversations, like you said, when you're talking to someone and where people just aren't throwing out things that aren't true, We need to rebuild that relationship. And maybe that's not with just the traditional journalist. Maybe that is with people. Maybe it's like people like yourselves. Maybe it's people on YouTube. But we have to get to a point where we believe that there can be facts, that people sharing information are fact checking, and that we're willing to have conversations if there are kind of disagreements.
Do you think there's anything we can do to help bring about this change? And like, I know obviously you're working from within the system of journalism to try and make it better.
Yeah.
But well,
Yeah. So, I mean,
go-
go ahead.
no, no, you go ahead.
Yeah. So, I mean, we know, I mean, there's studies and research out there that shows that if journalists are willing to be more transparent and get on the record about how they do things and why, that can help build trust. The other really, really important factor, though, is we have to be willing to talk to our communities. What questions do they have? We can't just ignore questions when they come in. If they have criticism or complain and say, like, which most of the time this is how they might interact with you, that story was so biased. We can't just ignore that. We need to ask why and take what they say into consideration and see, actually, this person's right. This story could have been better. We left out this entire voice. And I wish, like, looking back on Gamergate, like, that would have been kind of the best, I think, like, one of a good solution. If you had all these people who are in the industry and who are a part of the story saying, this is your reporting's biased. I wish a reporter would have, and maybe they did this, I don't know. But ideally, a reporter would look at that and say, wow, did I miss something? And then say, I didn't actually include any of these voices. So let's actually do another story and say, thank you for pointing out, we did not include this voice. We are including it now. That is like kind of an ideal situation. And journalists do that not very often. I wish we'd do it more. There's potential to do that more. And I think we need to do that more. We also need to talk more to our audience about what types of stories they want to see covered. What problems are they seeing in their neighborhoods? Not just kind of pick what we think is the problem and needs covered.
If somebody is reading this interview or watching it and they remain extremely black-pilled on journalism in general, and they think that they don't trust any of it, let's say, and they think it should like all be burned down, or they just don't believe any of it at all. Do you have anything you want to say to those people that might change their mind or might help them think about things in a different way?
Yeah, so I've talked to people like this. I know people like this, and the question I ask them is, where do you get your information? Because all of us needs information to make decisions, right? Whether that's, I mean, it could be small things like what you choose to put on in the morning to go outside. What's the weather going to be like, right? You're relying on information. Where are you getting that information? Um, while people may not see that as journalism, in some cases, those people, those are journalists, right? That's providing information. So we need information to make decisions in our lives. We're not just making decisions in a vacuum. I know I definitely am not. I look for information all the time to help me with decisions. And so we need information. And so I would then ask those people, okay, where do you go for your information? They may say, it's what I hear when I go into work. It's what I hear and what I see when I log online. Okay, so now where is that coming from? And kind of have a conversation about who those sources are. Why do they trust them? Where do, and then kind of also maybe evaluate, is that um, source trustworthy? Why or why not? And so the other thing I guess also is and I have done this, if there's a specific topic they're interested, kind of encourage them to read news organizations about coverage about that topic or issue and see what they think of it. And then I'm always glad to get on kind of another call with them to kind of talk about the pros, the cons, that kind of thing. But I
Okay.
think
Oh,
the key is, yeah, sorry, just to reiterate, just the key, we need information. So rely on it every day. People may not see it as news, But a lot of times it is, or it derives from some kind of news content or comes back to a news organization. And so we can't give up on information and news. That's not going to be possible.
All right, I want to be respectful of your time. I know you said you can only go for about
Yeah.
20 to 30 minutes. Is there anything else you want to talk about before we wrap things up?
No, I don't think so. I think, you know, if if we want to kind of be able to communicate with one another, live in a world where we can have conversations without getting into arguments or without kind of pulling into our own bubbles, we need to solve this problem of just being able to have cordial conversations and be able to find and be comfortable with finding facts and finding information. And I think there's a huge role that journalists and news organizations can play in it. There's a lot of things that I wish, especially national news organizations, would stop doing. Um, there's also a role that we as individuals can do in if we and a role that tech companies can do too. It's kind of like this three prong area. And I think it's something we all should be taking seriously and working on. And I wish, like I tell my family members, before you post anything on social media, like, is it true? Or are you just spreading a rumor? And again, I know it sounds silly, but that's how things start. And we kind of all have a responsibility to fact check ourselves and look at what we're sharing and the potential harm in that.
Okay. Do you have, as someone who's like a mini expert on the GamerGate thing, I guess, well, insofar as anybody is, do you have any advice from your experience talking about this and interacting with it for me to do this project and interview people? I know I've done like probably three-quarters of the interviews already, but obviously it's still an ongoing thing. I'm still trying to learn and grow and be a better person with it. So, do you have any advice for me?
Yeah, I mean, I think with any topic, I'm assuming you probably have, I don't know, would you say you have strong feelings about the topic and the coverage?
I don't know actually, because like I've been so
Okay.
disconnected in my with this stuff. I think I used to, and I think I still do to like a
Okay.
degree, but I've gone to like extreme lengths to try and counter my own biases, like maybe too much, in fact. Like I went
Okay.
into this thinking like, oh well, the truth is going to be somewhere in the middle, um, but and I treated the project that way for like the first like half of the project, and then now as I learn more stuff, I don't think it is in the middle. I've uncovered the GamerGate mystery, and the mystery is basically it's just a bunch of gamers who were unhappy about games journalism, didn't like censorship or what they perceived as being censorship. Um, a couple people online were assholes and maybe engaged in harassment, but like the vast majority of that actually was like actually not real. Um, and it wasn't from GamerGate people actually for the most part. Um,
Hmm.
no, I've got
Yeah.
receipts on
So,
this now. I've got proof that Brianna Wu kind of harassed herself, or sorry, that she lied about many aspects of her story, and so like it's just
yeah.
you
So it
know
sounds like, yeah, I mean, it sounds like you're doing fact checking that's necessary and that it's, I mean, this is what happens with when you start fact checking and when you start uncovering stuff. Like, it potentially takes you in a totally different direction. And as a journalist, you have to be ready for that. And you have to be like thinking, if you're surprised that it headed in that direction, that doesn't instantly mean it's the truth, right? You want to still do that due diligence of fact checking. Um, but that it sounds like you are doing what I would recommend to like any journalist or any investigative journalist I've worked with is you should not go in with a conclusion. You're going to go in, of course, with background information you have, background facts, your own experiences, right? But you need to go where the facts and where the information takes you. Um, and that may take you in a surprising route. That may take you in a totally different route than you expected. But you have to kind of follow those facts. And then I think the other thing is when you have all of that, especially in this case, is back to those people. who were maybe the journalists at the New York Times. You may not get an answer, but I would hope that you do, but you may not. But I think they deserve a chance to respond, and maybe there's information that you're missing. I'm not saying there is, but there's always that potential, right? Because that's one thing that's one of the faults of journalism. We can only report on the information we have. We are not all knowing. Like, you don't know everything that has happened, right? You only can report on and share what information you have, what others have told you. Don't share information. Sometimes information isn't there because it's being withheld for whatever reason. And so, always offering and asking people, even if you think they're going to say no, which I hear this so often. Oh, they'll never talk to me. Well, did you ask them? Like, you have to ask. And we have a responsibility to ask in multiple ways. Like, an email isn't good enough, you know? Um, and so I hope that you will do that. It sounds like, though, you're doing your due diligence of following where the facts go right now, which is good, even
Yeah.
if it's taking you somewhere where you didn't expect.
Yeah, and for sure, and like I should probably qualify my earlier statement slightly. Based on what I've seen, it appears that she lied. Uh, Brianna, rather than like say it's
Oh,
100%. Like I've even when I've talked about it with other people, I've been very careful, and I've been like I've laid out the exact archives and the exact timeline, and like I do leave out there's like a small insig. So basically, the claim that she made was that hundreds of messages that she received hundreds of messages saying that her game sucks and that she sucks on her forums, but there's no evidence that these exist, and she posted harassment against herself or something that looks like that on her official account, and then deleted it, which we have archives of that post. And then um, later, she claimed that the reason she made the post was so that she could guide the hundreds of people harassing her in the forums to all go on this one topic. But there doesn't appear to be any evidence at all that these. Well, there's one slight piece of evidence, but that's really weak. That there's anything like hundreds of posts that were made, like she said.
well, and so this is a case where, and I wish journalists we did this more. And I think there's been this expectation that, okay, you're working for a news organization, you have to come to a conclusion, right? Like, the goal of your reporting is to come to a conclusion. Well, unfortunately, sometimes that is not possible. Like, we cannot say with a 100% certainty in some cases, right, that something happened, because we are only able to come to a conclusion based on information that's available to us at that moment. And so, case like, if you were saying you are not 100% sure, I know that seems like a weakness in reporting or a weakness in sharing information, but I don't think it is. And I think instead you can do exactly what you're doing here, what you just did in kind of a short form is, this is what I know. This is what I don't know. I can't come to a conclusion, but if I had X, I could, and lay it out like that. And I think I wish we did more of that. And I know that's not maybe satisfying to some people, but it's better than making an assumption that you can't back up with facts or when you're not sure.
Okay. Well, hey, thank you so much for participating in this.
Yeah.
I'm interviewing someone else immediately after you. So, but like
Okay.
they said they're going to be watching this one, and so go as long as you want, and then interview me. So, because
Okay.
they don't
Well,
want to.
no, I'm glad to help. And yeah, I'm glad to help. And I wish you luck with this. I'm glad that you're doing this. And I hope it's something that is seen as, helpful, and maybe, I don't know, helps add some clarity to the issue. And I also really do hope that others that wrote some of the articles that people were upset about, I hope they are able that you're able to talk with them, because I think that would be important.
I might have to reach out to one or two of them. I plan on reaching out to Jesse Single. He was a big anti-gamergator back then, actually, believe it or not. Um, but actually, can I ask you one final question because I think it's interesting?
Yeah, sure.
Um, fuck, I've lost it. It was a pretty good question too. Oh, oh my gosh. I'm not usually this scatterbrained. I think it's because of the short time. Um,
Oh, you're fine.
Oh yeah, it's how important do you think all of the GamerGate stuff was?
In the sense of what?
I don't know because like everybody, people
Like
have wildly
like the
divergent
world,
views.
like the
Yeah, I mean, like, I guess you could break it down into like five different areas. Like, how important was GamerGate to human history? And like, that's probably pretty small. And then like, how important was it in terms of like the gaming industry, or how important was it in terms of like American politics, or how important was it in regards to the field
Mm.
of feminism and academia, and how important was it in the field of journalism? Like, there's like five or six or seven or 25 or 300 different ways you could ask the question, I guess. But um, I guess I guess
Wow.
I'll ask.
Yeah, I mean that's a big question.
Yeah. I guess I'll just ask. Um, well, you can take it. You can answer it however you want. But I guess when it comes to how important was GamerGate in terms of both its overall, I guess on its impact of journalism, since that's where you're an expert. Um, how important do you think it was in the history and philosophy and theory and practice of journalism?
So, I mean, I think unfortunately, I think for a lot of journalists, my guess is if you ask them about it, they probably wouldn't have a lot to say about it, wouldn't probably think it had any impact. Um, Now, maybe those studying journalism probably would say that impact was a little bit larger, or if they studied it, they could see its potential for a larger impact. I think for me, what it raised and what it still, which I think you see, I think you probably, and again, I'm sure there probably are people studying this, maybe, maybe not. But what it showed me is that journalists are, especially then, even so now, but are operating sometimes in these bubbles, information, but also just who they are. And just the lack of diversity, which is not just racial and ethnic and gender, but also just ways of life and interest and where they live, where they grew up. I mean, all of these things also are a lot more alike than we probably should be. And it's getting better. It's nowhere near where it needs to be. But when that happens, decisions about coverage are made that just don't reflect sometimes what the public is doing, public perception. And so I think Gamergate was kind of a wake up call for me of that. And I remember saying multiple times, like, people should be investing and covering gaming. And again, I'm not one that follows gaming coverage. I've seen a little bit more in mainstream, but I don't know that I've seen it press that much or as much as it probably should, with the number of people who maybe consider themselves gamers, who do play in the space, and with it just growing into the metaverse and kind of all of those other things, is, yeah, just that lack of coverage and the lack of expertise. What that leads to is potentially dangerous, right? Is potentially this poor coverage, potentially unethical coverage. And then I think you can tie that directly to, when you're more out of touch, think of the 2016 election, you think of January 6th, you think of things kind of that will continue to move forward. And I'm hoping we're learning our lesson, but I see signs that we're not, and we're not reflecting on where are holes in our coverage, where do we need to be investing and covering more, and really covering, right? Not just parachuting in, but really paying attention to what's going on in these spaces.
Yeah, speaking of parachuting in, I actually feel like I did a really shitty job with this interview. I feel it's the worst one I've ever done in my entire life, actually, or at least since starting the project.
No, I'm sure that's not true.
Yeah. Well, no, it's not your fault, really. It's just I knew that we could only go for like such a short period, So normally I have like that, like it's not, I don't know if it's 75 questions, like 50 questions or whatever, but normally these things go about 3 to 7 hours. Sometimes a little bit more, sometimes a little bit
Jeez.
less.
Whoa.
But yeah, obviously I don't expect you to spend that
Oh.
much time with me at all. And we've already agreed on only 20 to 30 minutes, which we've already surpassed. Um, what I should have done though, I probably should have like developed like 5 questions just for you, given the super short time span. But I didn't do that.
Well, if you do have follow-up questions, please let me know. I mean, you know how to get in touch with me. And I'm glad to, especially as you continue like reporting, as you know, hopefully reach out to, um, just some of the others involved. Um, just reach out. I'm glad to weigh in again.
Okay. Well, hey, thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.
Yeah.
If you want to talk to me about anything ever, feel free to shoot me a DM too. You know how to find me as well, or email. And
Okay. Sounds good. Good luck, and looking forward to seeing how it turns out.
thanks.
Okay.
All
Have
right.
a good night.
You too. All right. I'm going to raid myself, and then I'm going to bring in TPM, and then we're going to start a new stream. So go check out GamerGate book interview with the Pinko Merchant. That's coming up in just a few minutes here. Okay. Hey, we're not live right now. Just a heads up.